In 1943, Pennsylvania, if you stood on a hill 20 miles away, the horizon didn't just glow, it burned. A city of fire stretched across 800 acres, a relentless orange heartbeat that pulsed 24 hours a day. 31,000 men moved like shadows against the white-hot light of furnaces that never went cold. Every 6 months, they burst enough steel to build the Golden Gate Bridge. They weren't just making metal, they were forging the skeleton of the modern world. The Empire State Building, the warships that crushed the Axis powers, the very backbone of the American dream, it all came from here, Bethlehem Steel. It was an empire that seemed more permanent than the mountains surrounding it, invincible, too essential to fail. November 18th, 1995, 11:47 p.m. Blast Furnace C, a beast that had been breathing fire continuously since 1914, tapped its final heat. For 81 years, through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, that furnace never stopped. But that night, as the molten orange liquid flowed for exactly 23 minutes, something felt different. The men stood in a silence so heavy it felt like lead. When the flow stopped, the fire went out, and with it, 31,000 jobs vanished. An entire way of life evaporated. Today, tourists sip craft beer in the shadow of these rusted monuments. They look at the industrial aesthetic, but they don't see the ghosts. They don't hear the screams of the metal or the heartbeat of the thousands of men who gave their hearing, their health, and their lives to these cathedrals of fire. How does a giant that built the world collapse into a graveyard of rust in just 2 decades? This isn't just a story about steel, it's a story of broken promises, of corporate greed clashing with blue-collar loyalty, and a mystery that still haunts the valley. Because hidden in the ruins of Bethlehem is a warning for every modern industry. The brighter you burn, the faster you can go cold. Tonight, we step inside the cathedral. We're going back to the fire. The Architect of Ambition, the rise of Charles Schwab. To understand the fall, you must understand the man who dreamed the empire into existence. He wasn't born into royalty. He was Charlie. Charles Michael Schwab was the son of a wool merchant, a middle-class kid from the Allegheny Mountains with a smile that could melt iron. He wasn't a genius in the classroom. He was a genius of people. At 17, he was driving stakes into the dirt for Andrew Carnegie for $1 a day. 6 months later, he was a supervisor. By 24, he was managing the largest steel mill in America. Andrew Carnegie saw it, this rare, dangerous cocktail of grand vision and ruthless practicality. Schwab could dream of a skyscraper, but he could also tell you the cost per ton down to the penny. By 35, he was the president of Carnegie Steel. But Charlie didn't want to be a highly paid employee. He wanted the crown. In 1901, Schwab orchestrated what many call the deal of the century. He sat down with the titan of finance, J.P. Morgan, and convinced him to buy Carnegie Steel for $480 million. In today's money, that's $17 billion. Morgan combined it with others to form U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Schwab was the first president, earning a staggering $1 million a year. But he was miserable. Why? Because J.P. Morgan cared about stock prices and quarterly dividends in a New York office. Charlie Schwab cared about the smell of the furnace. He cared about the art of the pour. In 1903, he quit. He told the world it was for health concerns. The truth? He was going to build his own kingdom. He found his opportunity 100 miles north in a sleepy town called Bethlehem. The Bethlehem Iron Company was a relic, struggling, outdated, and small. But Schwab saw what the bean counters missed. He saw the Lehigh River for water. He saw the crisscrossing railroad lines. He saw the skilled German and Eastern European immigrants, men who understood metal in their blood. Schwab bought a controlling interest and renamed it Bethlehem Steel Company. Then he did something that made every other steel executive in America laugh. He bet the entire company on a single, unproven piece of technology from Britain, the gray mill. He spent $5 million, nearly $160 million today, on a massive rolling mill that could produce structural steel beams longer and stronger than anything ever seen. His peers called him insane. They said he'd be bankrupt in a year. Schwab just smiled and said, "Quality will sell itself." In 1907, the world stopped laughing. New York City was building the legendary Penn Station. They needed beams 60 feet long, capable of holding thousands of tons. No mill in America could do it, except Bethlehem. The gray mill rolled beams that were 30% stronger and 20% lighter. When architects across the globe saw Penn Station standing on Bethlehem's skeleton, the floodgates opened. The Woolworth Building, the George Washington Bridge, Grand Central, they all wanted the steel with the Bethlehem stamp. But Schwab was just getting started. He realized that if you want to be a giant, you don't just build the world during peace, you must be ready to arm it for war. In 1913, he made a move that would define the company's destiny for the next century. He secured a contract with the U.S. Navy for armor plating. Naval armor was a nightmare to make. It required advanced metallurgy and massive forging presses. It was expensive, dangerous, and required a level of precision that competitors couldn't match. By 1914, when the guns of August began to roar across Europe, Bethlehem Steel was no longer a local mill. It was one of only 3 companies on Earth capable of producing the armor that could withstand a battleship's shell. Revenue in 1914 was $48 million. By 1918, it was $495 million, a 10-fold growth in 4 years. The Cathedral of Steel was rising, fueled by a world that had suddenly learned how to kill on an industrial scale. Orchestrated violence, the science and the sweat. To understand the power of Bethlehem Steel, you have to look past the blueprints and the boardrooms. You have to understand the process. In its prime, the Bethlehem plant wasn't just a factory, it was an act of orchestrated violence against the elements. It was a 72-hour journey from raw earth to the skeleton of a skyscraper. It began at the Lehigh River docks. Massive Great Lakes freighters arrived like clockwork, carrying 10,000 tons of iron ore from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota. This was the richest ore in North America, 60% pure iron. Huge 20-ton cranes would scream as they clawed the ore out of the ships, dumping it into 20-acre stockyards. Then came the ingredients: iron ore, limestone from local quarries, and coke, coal that had been baked in airless ovens at 2,000 degrees until it was nearly pure carbon. This was the recipe for modern civilization. In the oven, that was the blast furnace. Imagine a structure 80 feet tall, lined with 3 feet of fire-resistant brick. Inside, a crucible held 2,000 tons of molten liquid. These furnaces never slept. They couldn't. If you let a blast furnace cool, the metal would solidify into a salamander, a multi-ton plug of iron that could take weeks to blast out with dynamite. So for 81 years, the fire in Furnace C roared. Every 6 hours, it was time to tap the heat. A crew would use a pneumatic drill to punch through a clay plug at the base. The heat was immediate. It hit the men like a physical wall, 140 degrees, even 15 feet away. Molten iron, known as pig iron, would erupt, flowing at 2,800 degrees. The light was so intense it was dangerous to look at without tinted goggles. But pig iron is brittle. It's dirty steel. To make it strong enough for a bridge, it moved to the open hearth. The workers called this building the Cathedral. It was half a mile long. Inside, oxygen was blown through the molten metal to burn off excess carbon. This was the most delicate part of the violence. Melters would test the chemistry every 30 minutes. If the carbon was 0.01% off, the steel could fail. And at Bethlehem, failure wasn't an option. Once the chemistry was perfect, the furnace tilted like a giant 200-ton teapot. The glowing liquid was poured into molds, forming massive ingots. These blocks of steel, still 800 degrees, were moved to the soaking pits to stay hot, because steel, like glass, must be worked while it's glowing. This was Schwab's pride, the gray mill. An ingot would pass through rollers 12 feet in diameter. With every pass, the steel was squeezed, elongated, and shaped, back and forth, until that crude block of metal emerged as a 60-foot I-beam. It was a symphony of fire and metal. At its peak, Bethlehem was processing 10,000 tons of ore every single day. The plant was a machine that consumed the earth and spat out the future. But a machine is only as good as the men who run it. The company town, the life of a steelworker. If the furnaces were the heart of Bethlehem, the men were the blood. In the 1940s and 50s, to say, "I'm from Bethlehem," didn't mean the city, it meant the plant. Meet a man like John Kovacs. He arrived from Hungary in 1911 and went straight to the gates. For 41 years, John's life was dictated by the 3-shift whistle. He woke at 5:15 a.m., not to an alarm, but to the rhythm of a body trained by decades of labor. His wife, Anna, would pack his steel lunch pail with rye bread, kielbasa, and a thermos of coffee. She never said, "Be careful." In the Steel Valley, those words were bad luck. You just said, "Dinner's at 4." The neighborhood of South Bethlehem was a literal melting pot. You could walk down 4th Street and hear Polish, Hungarian, Greek, Italian, and Russian. There were 47 bars in South Bethlehem alone. The bars opened at 7 a.m. to serve the night shift men coming off the line, and they stayed packed until the next shift change. Schwab had a philosophy for this: enlightened paternalism. He knew the work was brutal. He knew the noise of the furnaces stole men's hearing by the time they were 40. He knew that, on average, one man died for every 1,000 workers every year. To keep them coming back, he had to make Bethlehem Steel more than a job. He had to make it a world. The company built 2,800 houses with subsidized rent. They built a 120-bed hospital with full-time doctors. They built a gymnasium, 12 baseball diamonds, and a library with 12,000 books. Every summer, the plant shut down for one day for the company picnic. 60,000 people, workers and their families, eating free food and playing games. It was a beautiful, dangerous bargain. The company gave you stability, a pension, and a sense of pride. In exchange, you gave them your back, your hearing, and your absolute loyalty. It was a generational destiny. You didn't ask what you'd do after high school. You followed your father, your uncles, and your older brothers into the heat. You were a Bethlehem man. You were part of the arsenal of democracy. During World War II, that pride reached a fever pitch. When the men went to the front lines, the women, the Rosies, stepped into the furnace rooms. They produced 70% of the armor plate for the U.S. Navy. They built aircraft carriers, destroyers, and 4 million artillery shells. When Admiral Nimitz visited the plant in 1944, he told the workers, "This is where victory is forged." For 50 years, that pride sustained them. They believed the company was immortal. They believed that as long as the world needed to build, Bethlehem would be there to provide the bones. They were the backbone of America. But while the workers were focused on the fire, the foundations of the cathedral were starting to crack. The very things that made Bethlehem great, its massive size, its heavy traditions, and its guaranteed government contracts, were about to become its greatest liabilities. The fire was at its brightest, but the shadows were growing longer. The rust, the fall of the Titan. For nearly a century, Bethlehem Steel was convinced it was untouchable. But by the late 1960s, the arsenal of democracy was beginning to rust from the inside out. The fall wasn't caused by one single blow, but by a triple threat that changed the world while Bethlehem stood still. First came the energy. In 1973, the oil crisis sent shockwaves through the American economy. The cost of running 2,000-degree furnaces skyrocketed overnight. Suddenly, the sheer size of the Bethlehem plant, once its greatest asset, became its greatest liability. It was an energy-hungry dinosaur in a world where fuel was becoming gold. Then came the competition. While Bethlehem was still using 19th-century open-hearth technology, nations like Japan and West Germany had rebuilt from the ashes of World War II with state-of-the-art mini-mills. These new plants used electric arc furnaces to melt scrap metal, producing steel faster, cheaper, and with a fraction of the workforce. Bethlehem management, blinded by decades of dominance, dismissed these cheap imports until it was too late. But the final blow was the one they had promised to their own men: the pension crisis. For years, Bethlehem had practiced enlightened paternalism, promising lifetime health care and pensions to its workers. But by the 1980s, the company had more retirees than active workers. The legacy costs were billions of dollars in the red. The layoffs began as a trickle, then became a flood. In 1982 alone, the company lost $1.5 billion. One by one, the satellite plants in New York and Indiana went dark. On November 18, 1995, the unimaginable happened. At 3:10 p.m., the last heat of steel was poured in Bethlehem. After 140 years, the fire went out. The silence that followed was deafening. Thousands of men who had defined their lives by the furnace whistle were suddenly left in a world that no longer needed their sweat. Steel stacks. Resurrection. For over a decade, the Bethlehem plant sat like an 1,800-acre ghost. To some, the 5 massive blast furnaces, the stacks, were a rusting eyesore, a painful reminder of a lost era. Many called for them to be torn down and sold for scrap. But the people of Bethlehem refused to let their history be erased. In one of the most ambitious brownfield redevelopments in American history, the site was reborn. In 2001, the company officially filed for bankruptcy, and by 2003, it was dissolved. But from the ruins came Steel Stacks, a 10-acre arts and culture campus. Instead of tearing the furnaces down, the city turned them into a cathedral of memory. Today, the Levitt Pavilion hosts free concerts in the shadow of the machines that once built the Golden Gate Bridge. The Hoover Mason Trestle, once a private railway for ore cars, is now an elevated park where families walk where iron workers once fought for their lives. The Steel Bethlehem Corporation is gone, but it is never truly absent. Every time you walk through the lobby of a Manhattan skyscraper, cross a massive suspension bridge, or look at a map of a victorious world, you are looking at the legacy of the men and women of the Lehigh Valley. They didn't just make metal, they made the modern world. And while the fires have cooled, the steel remains unyielding, permanent, and forever part of the American soul.